Hello, and today we're going to be starting Chapter 22, Plant Organization and Homeostasis. We're going to be focusing on angiosperms specifically now that you know the evolution of plants. Then we're going to be talking about the different levels of organization and kind of the important parts of their different tissues and organs and everything that makes plants work. Here is a really helpful chart to kind of just give you an idea what's going on. Here's the organism, then we're going to get more specific as we go to the right. We have organ systems, the organs, tissues, and cells. Now the organ systems, we really just have the two, which is the root and the shoot. Organs, we have roots, stems, and leaves, which are part of the shoot. And then all of those have special tissues, the epidermal, the ground, and the vascular. And within each of those tissues, you have specific cells that go with those. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I also really want to focus on, it's kind of here at the bottom, the meristematic tissue. This tissue is not specialized. It is unique and it gives rise to all the other tissues. So it is a tissue, but it makes it possible for the other tissues to exist. We'll go through that and hopefully make sense later. Levels of organization. Homeostasis, as we know, is the process that maintains the stability of the organism's internal environment in response to changes in the external environment. So the whole idea is you have to keep the internal environment steady. Whatever goes on the outside, we have to make sure that the body is flowing, all the temperature, all the pH, all the salts, everything that makes the body work, be it a plant or an animal or whatever, has to have that homeostasis. It's part of those characteristics, if you remember long ago, about being alive. The organism, like we said, you have organism, organ system, organ, tissue, cells. And we know that angiosperms are the flowering plants. So that's our focus today. Now this chart here is going to save you. I would memorize this, make sure you know everything about it. So this is going to be talking about the top layer here are the monocots, the bottom are the eudicots. Now when you're looking at a seed, we have what's called one cotyledon, which is this protective seed leaf. This is the part of the plant that will protect the actual soon-to-be new plant as it emerges from the soil. So if you'll see when that first kind of plant that comes out, there's this little leaf there and that looks kind of dead later and they fall off. But that's the cotyledon. That's what's going to protect that fine little shoot as it's coming out of the ground from breaking. Monocots or monocotyledons get their name because of this one cotyledon or seed leaf. Eudicots, on the other hand, have two cotyledons. If you see this picture down here of the bean, if you've ever seen beans, how you can kind of split the seed in half, it's because that outer, those are the two cotyledons that are going to be happening. And so they have eudicotyledons for two cotyledons, monocotyledons for one. Now let's look inside the root structure here. On a monocot, it's really important to notice this pattern. In the root of a monocot, the xylem and phloem are in a ring. Okay, awesome mouse, right here. The pith is going to be in the center. We have here pictured as the phloem is the blue, the xylem is the red, and this is what it looks like. So make sure you memorize that. Of the eudicots, it's either going to be a star-shaped or sometimes it's a fancy-looking four-pointed box or square inside, but it's going to have all the xylem and phloem concentrated in the middle. Make sure you guys know that. Because when you get to the stems, in a monocot, the xylem and phloem, which we call vascular bundles, okay, make sure you guys know that, vascular bundles, they are scattered throughout the stem of the plant. If you look in the eudicots, the vascular bundles, on the other hand, are formed in a ring, but they're on the outer edge here, and they kind of have this triangular little carrot top-like thing going on. So it's kind of can get confusing between a monocot root and a eudicot stem. Make sure you guys understand the difference. If you notice too, in a root that's a lot smaller, we're looking at just one root instead of a huge part of the plant, which is going to be the stem. So there's going to be a lot higher concentration of xylem and phloem pictured if it's going to be in a stem versus what's going to be shown in the root. In a leaf, we look at a monocot, and what we call the vascular tissue here, we call it veins. So when you look at a leaf, it has veins, or you can look at the veination. Now the veins run parallel to each other, so they never cross. There's no crossing. It's kind of this thin layer that go up and down of the leaf. If that happens, you know it's a monocot. So all grasses, all those kind of things, corn, a lot of the wheats and those kind of things are all going to have that parallel leaf veination that makes them a monocot. However, in a Edicot, if you look here, the leaf pattern of the veins is going to be netted or web-like. There's going to be crossings, like a maple tree, or if you go outside, or an oak tree, and you can kind of see there might be one major kind of section going down the middle, but from that point, you can see all these little branches of veins coming off, and then they're going to branch off and branch off. So that is indicative of a Edicot. Now, if there's flowers around, you can also tell if it's a monocot or Edicot based on the flower petals. Now, if you're looking at a monocot, the flower parts or the petals are going to be in sets or multiples of 3. Okay, I think about this, mono is going to have one answer, which is 3. And Edicots are going to have 2 answers, because it's Edicot. Their flower petals can be in patterns of 4 or 5. Now, if you happen to find a plant with 12 petals, you're going to have to look at the other things to help you determine if it's a monocot or a Edicot. So make sure you guys memorize this chart. It's going to save you throughout the semester, and especially when you get more detail about the plants. Here are terms to know the basic plant anatomy. So leaf is what we call collectively called the blade and the petiole. So then you have a blade itself, which is the foliage of the plant, and the petiole is actually the stalk that attaches that blade, that leafy part, that big broad area, actually to the stem. So you have the leaf, what we call both, kind of the blade, and the petiole, and that's what kind of a leaf is called. Excuse me. A stem, okay, that allows for the primary, which we call length, and secondary, which is width or girth growth. Now, how I remember primary growth is when you're little, the very first way you grow is tall. Secondary growth, when you're older and you stopped growing, the only way to grow is out. Okay, so you have your primary going vertical or lengthwise, and then your secondary growth is going to be the width or the girth. Now, the node, this is a place where the leaves or flowers are going to actually attach to the stem. Then you have something called the internode. This is area between the nodes, so it's the open space in between. You have the terminal or apical bud, apical meaning the tip or the top, like an apex predator kind of thing, the very top leader there. And so this is the area where there's going to be a bud, and it's at the very tip of the shoot that produces the new leaves. This is where length is actually occurring. Plants don't go from the bottom, they go from the top. Auxiliary bud is the bud above the node. So you have your little node where the leaves and flowers attach, and then you're going to have this auxiliary bud kind of hanging out here. And that's what's going to produce those lateral stems, or as we know, branches, or it could also lead to flowers. Now here is a picture with these little lines. I want you guys to practice seeing if you can label this correctly. So I'm going to just continue, but here is your word key over here on the side. See if you guys can match up where these go. Here are the answers. So make sure you guys review this. It's the same terms we just went over. So make sure you guys can label the anatomy of the plant. Let's talk a little bit about annual versus perennial plants. And annual means one growing season. So those who speak Spanish or Latin-based type things, años is year, okay, in Latin, and año is year in Spanish. So annual just means they have one growing season. Perennial means they can regrow each season from the roots. So the tops can die off, but the roots are going to go in kind of a hibernation stage, where then they can wait out the winter until conditions are right, and then they can start growing back up to the stem. Now, perennis is Latin. Okay, I think it's perenne. Spanish for long lasting. So that's how you guys can remember annuals and perennials. So, some common annuals include the marigolds and petunias. Okay, so these guys right here. Some examples of perennials include the daylilies. Those are what you guys may be dissecting in this class. Now let's talk about these terms, the evergreen versus deciduous trees. Evergreens, they retain their leaves, they do not drop them. It's easy to remember, evergreen, they're always green. Deciduous trees lose their leaves each season, and it's called abscission, which means to drop off. So fall, when you see all the leaves changing colors and everything like that, those are deciduous trees. Let's talk a little bit now about plant organ systems. As we know, there's the shoot system and the root system. The shoot system is all above ground. It's made up of the stems and the leaves. The root system is below the ground, and these are just the roots. Pretty easy to remember. Some of the root functions are that it anchors the plant and it absorbs materials, okay? And the number of root hairs there are, if there's more root hairs, the absorption rate will increase. So it's really good to have a lot of root hairs if you're a plant, because then you can start absorbing a lot more. So when you see this right here, this plant germinating, you can see those little root hairs starting to grow, and that's going to give the plant the enough nutrients it can to continue to emerge from the ground and become a big plant. Alright, let's talk about different root types now. We have taproot and fibrous roots. Taproots, this is when you have one main root that's specialized for food storage. A lot of these are associated with the Edicot. So we have carrots and beets and radishes. Now if you look at this plant over here, this new little seedling, you can tell that it has this really long kind of central root with these little secondary branch roots coming out. Now this, you can't really tell right here, but you can start seeing this getting a little thicker here. That's what's going to be used for storage. These secondary roots are going to be there to help provide more nutrients to give it more surface area. But the major focus on the storage and gathering nutrients will be this taproot. Think of a carrot. At the top of the carrot, it's all green here, and then you have that big orange part. That's the taproot. Now fibrous roots, these guys don't have any main root that's coming down. They just have a lot of just major roots that kind of are just superficial that go throughout. These are generally associated with the monocots, such as grasses. This is a corn here, and as you can see, there's not a major root coming down the middle. They just have lots of these long roots that helps them to absorb their nutrients. Here's just another picture, and just for fun, carrots can come in lots of different colors and varieties, so that's kind of cool. If you live out in Arizona or Texas and New Mexico, the mesquite tree is a big example of a taproot. Their roots can go down 40, 50, 60 feet into the ground, and the tree can only be, 15 feet tall. And so they can go all the way down into the soil where they can reach that water. So just so you guys remember, taproots, they're specialized to store water and food nutrients, and these guys are really great in drought settings because they have that added storage and the ability to kind of go way down into the soil to find the water sources. Alright, so here's some more examples of fibrous root. Right here, these guys have many small roots that can branch out, and this is going to increase the surface area. The more surface area a plant has, the more it's able to absorb the nutrients and the water and everything that it needs. It's like going to a buffet with lots of little mouths all over the place instead of just one, and so you're able to have more. So both plants, or both types of plants, have taproot and fibrous. Surface area is super critical for all plants. But this one here, they don't have the taproot, so they just focus on many smaller branching roots that have to increase their surface area. Now these guys have less structural support. As you can see, they don't have a major root or anchor system that's coming down. They just have these little guys on the side. So a lot of time when there's big storms and everything, you'll see, palm trees being uprooted and a whole bunch of stuff. It's because they aren't anchored to the soil. Now some examples here, we have lettuce, grass, bamboo, bananas, lilies, rice, wheat, onions. So there's a lot of other plants that have this too. Now let's talk a little bit more about specialized or modified roots. We have something called root nodules. This is the first picture up here with this dime. This is where bacteria actually will live inside these nodes, and they're able to fix nitrogen for the plants. Now, all plants need nitrogen, and plants that have these root nodules can live in areas where nitrogen isn't as abundant. And so legumes are really, really lucky because they have these root nodules. So legumes such as peas and beans, they're able to have these little symbiotic relationships with the bacteria to help them increase their nitrogen levels in the soil. Another special modified root is the mycorrhizae. This is also known as fungus root, and this increases the surface area or nutrient absorption dramatically. So if you look here, here's a plant. You can kind of see its major root system here, and so the branching really would probably only come out to about that far. But because they have the mycorrhizae, you can see how much further the plant is able to extend its little reaches and able to absorb more nutrients. And there's a lot of plants out there in the world that won't even germinate if they don't have this special fungus associated with them in the soil. So having the mycorrhizae is very, very important for increased surface area absorption. Now we have these other kind of specialized roots. The storia is called, it's a root-like projection that actually will tap into another plant's vascular tissue. So for example, these are really parasitic plants. Many of you have probably seen mistletoe in the trees around the area, and what they do is this. They come in and they just burrow into the vascular tissue and just start leaching off all the nutrients that the plant is creating for itself. We also have daughters and broom rapes. Those are over here. And those can be found, and they're also specialized roots that are parasitic to the plants around them. Adventitious roots, on the other hand, are advantageous. These guys actually have roots that are above the soil, and this makes it possible so they can have increased oxygen down into their roots. Because oxygen is really good for, you have to have this barrier, and you don't want to get it too soggy down in the roots because then they can rot. But it's that barrier to help them with the nutrient absorption. You have to have some chemical reactions going on in order for the absorption to occur. So some example, this is a corn stalk, also some bamboo or special plants down in the tropics. They have a lot of these adventitious roots where it rains a lot to kind of help sure that they don't get soggy down down under the soil. Over here is a giant banyan tree, and these guys can go for blocks long, and you can tell these even drop their roots from almost up in the branches, it seems like, that they're coming all the way down. But these are, in fact, roots. So pretty cool. Now let's get into stem functions. Now, these guys, the stem, the whole point of really for them is to be a support for the leaves where photosynthesis takes place, and to be the major area of transportation. So you're going to have xylem that flows up, so that's the water transportation device, so it goes from the xylem, so from the roots up. Phloem is from the nutrients are created up in photosynthesis, and that's going to be from phloem down. So you'll see that kind of throughout the notes. So xylem up and phloem down, just the directions of those nutrients. Now let's talk about some specialized modified stems. You have something called stolons. Now these are above ground horizontal stems. So these are not roots, but they are actually stems. So looking here, a lot of grasses like torpedo grass and such like that, they have these stolons that come across, and those are connected to each other. And strawberries, one of my favorite fruits, they come, and that's how they propagate. So they can it's kind of like cloning in a way. And so they can create these specialized stems, these stolons, to create a new little individual plant growing. And that's how a lot of different plants can propagate that way. Rhizomes are another type of specialized stem. These guys are very similar to stolons, except for they're underground, and so they're horizontal stems. So irises, violets, and some other types of grasses have rhizomes. So that's when they're connected underground, and then they can make a new body of a plant coming up. Tubers. Now these guys are technically just enlarged rhizomes, so they are stems. So these guys function in food storage. So your potato is actually a stem. Technically it's a tuber, right? But it is part of the stem system. And so you'll see here like sweet potatoes, taro, yams, all those kind of things are actually tubers, which is a form of a stem. So make sure you know these, because some of these will be on your quizzes and tests. Now a corm. A corm is a bulbous underground stem. Okay, it's used to produce new plants, and these can lie dormant in the winter. So the gladiolus, these flowers over here, what they do is they have these corms. So it's kind of interesting. You have the corm before cleaning, so when you do it for winter, you cut it off, and then these are the old corms. So they kind of just develop these new bulbous stems on top of each other, but they're in the soil a little bit, so they're kind of right there resting on the ground and also on top. So they're very interesting, but it helps them to be a perennial for the next coming years. Now let's talk about some things I want you to note. So some plants produce the hormone auxin that promotes root formation from stems. Therefore, they can be propagated from actual stem cuttings. Many of you guys probably have philodendrons in your house or seen them at least in the store. And what you can do is you can go to one, you can clip off a little stem, stick it in water, and then it can start actually producing its own roots. So that's what they did over here in this experiment. You just put these little stems in a jar of water, put them in the sunlight, and they will in fact start growing roots. And so these guys can pretty much, they beat a lot of the odds. So if they become invasive plants, which are plants that can kind of take over an area, you can see that it's very, very easy for them to do that. So these are actually stems that, through that special hormone auxin, can form roots. Let's now talk about leaf functions. Of course, leaves do photosynthesis. They absorb CO2 and release oxygen and water. There are specialized or modified leaves as well. We have things called spines, and then instead of having leaves that are, the blade is very broad, they just have these tiny little spines, and this allows for, it minimizes water loss. So a lot of cacti and a lot of those pokey things out there, those are their leaves that have been modified because they don't really need to have that broad blade, because then they're going to lose a lot of water. And so they have these spines used for protection, and they have their photosynthesis actually in the different parts of the cacti, like the pad and everything like that. So pretty cool. Modified leaves can also be called tendrils, and these aid in climbing, because the higher the plant is, the closer it is to the sun, the more food it's going to be able to make through photosynthesis. And so over here is a cucumber, and it has these little tendrils, and I'm sure many of you guys have seen these. Even lots of weeds do these kind of things with the tendrils on the fences, like at your school or something. You can see then that they're trying to get taller and closer to the sun to get more nutrients. Bulbs. Many of you have heard of bulbs before. These are actually underground modified leaves, and they are produced, onions, for example. These guys are bulbs, right? But they're technically leaves. And tulips. These are actually leaves. Blows my mind every time. So they're underground storage, and they're composed of what we call modified leaves, and to attach to this little vertical stem. So tulips, lilies, all these, you have this bulb, which is just the leaf, and they have these tiny little roots underneath. You can kind of see right here in the onion. And then the stem is just kind of in the very base. So you have this leaf that's can be planted, essentially. Now, leaves are really cool because you have carnivorous type plants that have adapted to live in those nitrogen poor soils. And the only way that they can get their organic nitrogen is actually from digesting insects. So we have the Venus flytrap, sundews, pitcher plants, pretty amazing plants out there in the world that know how to essentially eat animals. And so here are some picture plants, the Venus flytrap here. Here is the African sundew plant. Here's a cool video I want you guys to watch on your own time. I will attach it when I post my PowerPoint, so you'll have it. Tissues. So tissues. We have the roots, the stems, and the leaves contain these three types of specialized tissue. We have the epidermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue. Now, all of these tissues, like I kind of mentioned at the very beginning, all arise from what we call meristematic tissue. Now, our meristem is very similar to what we call our stem cells. This meristematic tissue gives rise to plants, and it's because it has undifferentiated cells, so like stem cells. They have all the information, all the genetic code to be epidermal, ground, or vascular. And it just depends where they are within the plant. When they mature, they become those other three types of tissues. And so these guys can be found in the zones of plant where growth can take place. So at the very tip, down in the roots, or at the very tip of the apical bud in the shoot, or where the branches are going to be coming from. Now this chart is found in your lab manual on page 77. I highly recommend you memorize it. It doesn't talk about the meristematic tissue, but make sure you know that it gives rise to these three other tissues, that it is unspecialized. These are specialized. So meristematic tissue, unspecialized. Dermal or epidermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue are, in fact, specialized. So dermal tissue or epidermis, these in the roots, it protects the inner tissues, has root hairs that are used to absorb water and minerals. In the stems, it protects the inner tissues, and the epidermal tissue protects inner tissues of the leaves, and it's the cuticle, which is this waxy substance on that side of plants. So if you touch a plant, it has that waxy kind of feeling to it. That is actual dermal tissue, and it's wax. It's called a cuticle. The cuticle prevents water loss. The stomata, which are the holes in the plants, which we'll show you, means mouth. Stoma means mouth, and those carry on gas exchange. Ground tissue. Now you have something called the cortex and the pith, and we'll show you those pictures in a moment. But the cortex, it stores products of photosynthesis. The pith in the root stores products of photosynthesis. And the stems carries on photosynthesis if it's green. So cacti or palo verde, those type of plants, the cortex of the ground tissue will actually undergo photosynthesis. The pith will store products of photosynthesis. And in the leaves, we have something called the mesophyll. Now that is where photosynthesis occurs. So ground tissue is where photosynthesis takes place. Vascular tissue, which is specifically xylem and phloem, in the roots, we call it a vascular cylinder, okay? And this is it transports water and nutrients. So all these are going to transport nutrients and water. The vascular cylinder in the roots. Vascular bundles, because there's more of them now, are going to be in the stems, and the leaf vein is going to be in the leaves. So make sure you guys know the names of those and all the functions here. Now just to kind of go over a little bit more, the basic tissue functions. Dermal tissue is for protection. It covers the outer surface, okay? So we have the stems, and the leaves have that waxy cuticle. It protects from water loss and disease. The modified epidermal cells would be the root hairs and the guard cells. Now the guard cells surround that stomata, that hole in the bottom of leaves. And these swell and close, allowing the hole to be either open for gas exchange or closed to make sure that none of the water is evaporating out of the plant. And so that is really critical to make sure the plant doesn't dry out. In woody type stems, the epidermis is actually replaced by what we call the periderm. Now, epidermal cells are replaced by cork cells, and these actually protect against disease. And so lots of the trees have some type of cork, especially where the major cork tree comes from. It's mostly cork. So we have cork cells are produced by the meristem called cork cambium. Okay. Now bark is essentially the dead cork cells. So on the outside, the very, very outside, where it's all kind of dry and everything, that's the bark. Now when you go just past, you peel off the bark, that's where the live tissue is going to be. And then if you go further in, it's actually going to be all the dead xylem cells that have been crushed over time. And so the only parts of plants, especially on trees, that are actually alive is the outer, well, you have the protection of the bark, and then you have that core cambium, the xylem and phloem are, well, the phloem, excuse me, and that's where the plant is able to have the living cells. Now the ground tissue. Ground tissue has a lot of different kind of specialized cells that we kind of need to go over tissue here. And so ground tissue is literally the filler or the bulk of the plant. This forms the cortex and the pith, and there are 3 types. We have the parenchyma, the collenchyma, and the sclerenchyma. Here it just kind of shows you all 3 of them together, and then below we'll talk more detail. The parenchyma, this is the least specialized. It's found in roots, stems, and leaves, and its functions can vary. In the leaf, the photosynthesize and contains the chloroplast. So this is in the mesophyll. Okay, so this is where photosynthesis takes place. In the roots and stems, it's storage, and it's the pith and the cortex, and it's usually kind of soft and spongy. In the roots, it can be the secondary root production, and in seeds, it's actually the endosperm. So parenchyma has a lot of specific major functions in a plant's ground tissue. Collenchyma are uneven, thickened primary cell walls, and this just provides extra support, especially where there's going to be new growth. If you've ever eaten stalk and you kind of break it and it has that stringy stuff, that is some example of collenchyma. Sclerenchyma is also thickened secondary walls with what we call lignin. Now this gives it kind of that rigid support to mature plants. And these cells are actually, they die when they're mature, so they're actually no more living. They have fibers, which is associated mostly with the vascular tissue, and these are long bundles that are going to give that strength. They have sclerids. These are, for example, the kind of stone cells in pears. It's kind of that gritty stuff when you eat pear. These are shorter in length, and it kind of gives hardiness and kind of more of that support for the plant. Vascular tissue. Its major function is transport and support. So xylem, we know, transports water and minerals from the roots to the leaves. It's hollow and it's actually no longer living. They're dead cells. As part of the xylem, you have things called vessel elements. Now this is the pipeline with perforated end plates, and I'll show you a picture. So there's kind of like holes in it that have these little sections to help with the water flowing up. They also have what's called tracheids, kind of like in your throat. It's tracheid because it's tapered with pitted cross walls. It's supportive. So feel your own. You kind of feel the ridges there. That's what tracheids are kind of like. Phloem, now phloem transports that organic nutrients such as sugar, which for plants is sucrose, and glucose, from the leaves to the roots. Now they have what's called sieve tube members. This is the cytoplasm with no nucleus. So they just have all the cytoplasm, but there's no brain center yet. And these have end walls with channel pores. Now you have companion cells that are next to these sieve tube members, and this is the cells that have the nucleus. So they're kind of the command center over here, and here's all the machinery doing its job. I want you guys to know that the plasmodesmata connects companion cells to sieve tube members. Okay, this is in the phloem. The nucleus in companion cells controls and maintains the life of both the cells. Kind of cool about phloem. So here's the picture here. The green in this picture are the xylem vessels. Here's the sieve plates and trachea, I think you can, or tracheids right here. The perforated plates, vessel member, here's the tracheids, and then the fibers there. So remember, xylem is no longer living. But in phloem, here are the sieve areas. Here's the companion cells that will have the nuclei inside. It's kind of these little darks here, and the sieve elements. And then you have fibers as well. So make sure you guys know the sieve tube members are what's going to be connecting everything together, okay? So the sieve areas and the sieve members are in here. Vascular tissue can be found in the leaves, which we call veins, the stems, which is vascular bundles, and the roots, which is vascular cylinder. I've said this I don't know how many times. You probably are going to have this on your exam. So this is what the vein looks like in a leaf. See how this one's netted. It has the major kind of phloem line coming down here, or sorry, the xylem line and the phloem. And then it branches off here, and they would cross if they were a little bit longer. So we know this has to be a Edicot. So anytime that you have this branch and another one coming off to the side like that of the leaf, you know that this has to be a Edicot. And then you can also look down in the stem. You can see how the vascular bundles are formed in a ring. You have the pith in the center, and then this other filler area is the cortex. Okay, and then you have the dermal tissue on the outside, the epidermis. Okay, here's what it looks like in a monocot. It's all scattered, everything like that. And then down in the Edicot root, so here's kind of like that X or a star, whatever it is, and that's where it's concentrated in the middle. And you actually don't have a pith in a Edicot root, just to let you know. I like this picture because it shows you the different types of tissues and where they're located. So make sure you review that as well. Now, the meristematic tissue. This is unspecialized embryonic tissue. It's in the tips of stems and roots. It matures and gives rise to that dermal, ground, or vascular tissue. You have something called the apical or apical meristem. It's found in the tips of the roots and shoots. Okay, so it's at the very extreme areas, the very tip or the very bottom. Now this is primary growth, which we know is in height or direction, lateral direction, right? Horizontal is secondary growth. All right. So there actually are three types of meristematic tissue. Okay, so a protoderm produces epidermal tissue. Ground meristem produces ground tissue. I think I just said that wrong. Protoderm produces epidermal tissue. Ground meristem produces ground tissue, which is going to be the cortex, the pith, the mesophyll. Procambium, which we talked about a second ago, produces the vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem. Now, this is a big review video. I recommend you go watch it to help you if you're still a little bit confused. It has some pretty good diagrams that you guys can watch, so make sure you check that out. Now let's move on to organization of tissues in roots, stems, and leaves. If you take a longitudinal cut, so that's the long cut, so a plant's growing like this, and the longest one would be going down. Okay, the very tip you have what's called a root cap. Okay, so we're looking at roots here. At the root cap, that's going to be the very end. It's going to be, it protects, kind of like a helmet, it protects the cells and zone of their cell division from abrasions because it's pushing down on these rocks. And of course, you want to make sure that none of those sensitive cells, because this is where it's growing, stay intact. Now we have something called, we have three different zones in a root tip. We have a zone of cell division, which contains the apical meristem, adds that primary growth, that length down of the roots, and it produces those unspecialized cells to be added to the root cap. And Z and E are the zones of elongation, which is the next one. Zone of elongation, this is where the cells start to becoming longer and specialized. And then you have the zone of maturation. This is where cells become fully differentiated. They're easily recognized by the epidermal cells producing root hairs. So there's no root hairs, and then all of a sudden, bam, you have root hairs. And we know that that's the zone of differentiation or maturation. So here's a picture. Let's see if I move my face. So here's the root cap. As you can see here, this is all, there's no root hairs. So the very tip, the zone of division, or as we call it, zone of division. Here it's zone of elongation, how the cells are getting a little bit longer, as you can tell here. And then once they hit the zone of maturation or differentiation, you can see that they're specialized. You're going to see definitive areas of xylem and phloem, you're going to have the cortex, and you're going to have root hairs. Now if you take a cross section of a Edicot, so here's a plant, and you take a cross section, so a cross, okay, a cross, we're going to look at above the zone of maturation. So now we know we have all the cells that are specialized. You have the epidermis, it's the outer layer, it produces the root hairs. You have the cortex, made up of the parenchyma cells. Major function is food storage, such as starch granules. The vascular cylinder contains the endodermis, which definitely check out your lab book. It goes into a little bit more detail about that. The endodermis, it's the protection, it's kind of a wax layer that allows the water not just to saturate the root. It has the pericycle, the xylem and phloem, okay? The endodermis, which like I talked about just a second ago, it's regulatory in function due to the Casparian strip, okay? It's the only way water and minerals can get to the vascular cylinder is through that endodermal cell. It's kind of like the bouncer. It makes sure not too much is flooded into the plant to saturate it, but then it has just enough to, it lets just the right amount in. The pericycle adds to the secondary or lateral growth of the roots, okay? Now if you take a cross section of a monocot, okay, it's going to be the same as a dicot plus the pith when we're looking here, because it has that area, that center area, okay? So make sure you guys know the differences between those two. Just to emphasize, here's the epidermis. That'll be the this is the Edicot. The cortex, the endodermis, and then you're gonna have your vascular cylinder, okay? Over on the monocot, you're gonna have the same things, right? The cortex, the epidermis, the endodermis with the Casparian strip. And then you're going to have your vascular cylinder, and inside you have the pith. And stems, let's check this out, okay? This is a longitudinal cut, is the apical meristem found in the stem tip, terminal bud, has primary growth. Here, we're going to look at the cross-section. So as you can see, the xylem and phloem, this is in the Edicot, vascular bundles, the epidermis, cortex, pith. On the monocot side, you have your scattered vascular bundles, and then epidermis and pith. What are Edicots? So let's look at twig anatomy. What's neat about this is that if you look at a tree and a little branch, you can actually determine how old that branch is without having to cut it open and count rings like you do on the actual big stem. So with the twig anatomy, we have to look at what we call the bud scar. It's the bundle scars, okay? And we look at leaf scars or lenticel, node, internode, axillary, and terminal buds. That's what we need to know. Abscission is when we talked about earlier, is when the leaves drop off and they leave a scar. The lenticel is breaks in the periderm, and this functions in gas exchange. So, in order to age a stem, you count the number of bud scars that are left. So looking here, these little white dots, okay, those are the lenticels. If you look here, you can see where the bud scars, or excuse me, the leaf scars are, okay? Now here, this is the terminal bud, right? We talked about how the apical bud is where things grow. This used to be the very edge, the very tip. But then when winter came and died and it started to come spring, these fall off and you're able to grow more of the branch. And then you get a new terminal bud, okay, or scar. So here's a fresh one down here. You can see the vascular bundle scars and then the fresh terminal bud. But when it becomes winter, it dries out and will fall off and leave a scar. It's pretty neat. So here's just an example. It has to be attached to a tree for you to know exactly how old it is. But if you just pick up a twig, you say, well, at least this twig has been around for so many years. So looking here, pretend that it's been attached to the tree. You have the first terminal bud scar. That's what you're looking right here, right? That fell off. So it looks just like this. So you have one here, and then it grew this long the next year. And then you notice I had this little branch. Well, that from this point on, that was 1 year old from the next year, and so forth. So if you just look at the main kind of branch here, it was 1, 2, 3, 4 years. So 2009, that was a great growing year. It's also the branches as it goes towards the end to kind of grow a little bit more. That's just some examples here of how you can count the age of a twig. Secondary growth. This adds girth or width, and it occurs in the woody dicots. Under the vascular and the cork cambium the lateral meristematic tissues. They develop during the second and the subsequent years of growth. So not the very first year, because they're kind of squishy and still little succulent guys, but then they get woody as they get bigger. The vascular cambium between the bark and the wood, okay, it's the meristematic tissue, produces that secondary xylem and phloem. The cork cambium replaces the epidermal cells with those cork cells, forming that periderm that adds protection and waterproofing. So when we look here, this is the cross section of a tree. It's technically the cortex, okay? You have the phloem, and then the cambium, and then the xylem. Xylem is not living tissue, so it doesn't grow more, and so it's going to be breaking down and doing, as it expands and each growth lays down each year, it's going to be crushed. So to count, let's say we're going to count the age of this tree. You count the growth rings, and they grow every year. So we have, this was the first year of growth, there's the second year, third year, fourth year, and this is the fifth year, okay? And then you have this outer edge, which will be the bark, which will expand out. So bark, periderm, we said cork and cork cambium, phloem, as we talked about, debarking can actually kill the tree. If you take an axe and you cut completely all the way through down past the phloem, you can, it's called girdling, and you can kill the tree. So secondary xylem, okay, this is the sapwood or the newest wood, okay? You have a heartwood, sorry, down here you have your bark, which is the phloem, the xylem, which is the wood, then you have your pith, which we call the heartwood, okay? Once it's old enough and no longer squishy, so after the year or two, that pith becomes the heartwood. The sapwood are the newer outer areas of that old xylem, okay? And like I said, the pith disappears with age. It will become like this tiny little dark area generally is what happens if it's a really old tree. Here's a video you can watch to give you some more insight on this information. Primary growth, okay, this is what we've been looking at. With this would be what? Think about it for a second. It is a Edicot stem, right? Because the vascular bundles are in a ring. Okay, so this is secondary growth. You can see here the xylem is the XP's phloem, and it layers out. So once it comes in and that grows, the xylem's dead, right? Then it forms a new layer, and then that gets crushed as it comes further and further out. Okay, so it's pretty cool how that works. Here's just another example. You have the cork, part of the bark, right? Phloem and the cork equal the bark. Then you have the vascular cambium, then the sapwood, which is, we know is the xylem, right? And the older areas is called the heartwood. Now, you can, like I said, you can count, you can age trees by counting their yearly growth rings. So this tree was a total of 110 years old. So here's kind of that pith that used to be there, right? The heartwood starts to get dark and disappear. And you can literally count all these growth years. You can see where there might have been a really good year of growth, if there was a bigger gap. And if it was kind of not so great, a little small, hard to tell, it might have been a more difficult or challenging year of the growth from the tree. Now this is a redwood, and it is 1,341 years old. And it's just amazing to think kind of the history that it has lived through, and so it's fun to kind of check that out. Now some of the oldest trees in the world are called bristlecone pines. Now the research, this was done in the Great Basin, and I was doing some research out there. These bristlecone pines can grow in 6 of the western United States, and they can live to be at least 5,000 years old. They live at high elevations. This was about 10,000 some feet, I think, and they look like they're dying. They do, but they're actually living, doing their thing, doing what they need to do, and they've lived for thousands of years. It's pretty neat. Leaves. So, as we talked a little bit about earlier, stoma literally means mouth in Greek. Stomata is just plural. And this is the opening for gas exchanges. So if you look at this picture down here, so this hole is a stoma, if there's multiple, it's stomata. Now these are the guard cells we talked about earlier that open and close that hole. They're kind of like lips. They open there, like this, and then they close. That's how they work. And so as we know, the guard cells are dermal tissue, and they surround the stoma. There's upper and lower cuticle. Okay, that's part of the epidermal tissue. So you have a cuticle up here, and you have a cuticle down here. Now with the stomata, just came in my mind, there can be on the top. They're mostly on the bottom, but you can have holes on both top and bottom. Ground tissue. Okay, the mesophils are the areas that undergo photosynthesis. So you have the palisade mesophil and the spongy mesophil. How I remember palisade is I think of a palisade wall, like a castle. They're tall and erect and sturdy, and that's how palisade. And then spongy is just like sponge. It's kind of all over the place, and there's some holes and gaps in it. So those are the major parts where photosynthesis takes place. That's where the chloroplasts are housed. In the vascular tissue, we call it a vein and a leaf. And so you have the xylem and phloem over here. This diagram will be something you also should memorize. So make sure you guys know it and can label the dissection or the cross section of of this leaf. Yeah. All right. Just to further demonstrate what's going on here, the stomata are small holes. Okay. The guard cells are the ones that open and close, and they prevent water loss in the case if it's the hot time of day or something like that, then they can close. Or when a plant is stressed, there's actually a hormone that causes these guard cells to change. To either, if there's water inside the guard cell, it will open up, kind of like a jelly bean. When it's inflated like a balloon, it will push against each other and make that opening. But then when there's less water inside, it kind of wilts a little bit, and that's how it closes. Phloem transport. So as we talked about, phloem is from source to sink. Photosynthesis takes place in most plants in the leaves. Some can happen in the stems, but mainly in the leaves. So it starts from the source, and then they have to go down to feed all the cells and everything down to the roots. And so that's kind of what's going on here, looking at the phloem. Now, phloem is a mixture of the sucrose and water. So there has to be water there as well. So what happens is you have transpiration. Okay, that's how water gets from the roots to the top. And we'll go into this a little bit more detail later, but transpiration takes absolutely no energy. It's free energy for the plant to use. And so when the water goes up there, when it gets into the leaves, then it can flow into the phloem and mix with the sugars and everything like that, and then it will be able to sink back down into the roots. Now, translocation, okay? This is the movement of organic solutes, like the sugars of the water, from a source to a sink through the phloem by means of mass flow. So it's just saying there's a lot of stuff mixed into the solutes, and then it can go from the top to the bottom. So that's really all you need to know. Translocation and transpiration. Transpiration is like transport and evaporation. Translocation is transport and relocation. Plant hormones. So just like all living things have hormones, so do plants. Hormones allow plants to respond to the environment by a chemical signal. That's what hormones are. And it can be transported through the xylem, the phloem, or from just all the different cells. We talked a little bit about auxin, but it's a hormone responsible for what we call tropism. Now, tropism is a growth response toward something or away from a stimuli, okay? And so there's a couple that we're going to focus on. You have phototropism. Photo is orientation of a plant in response to light. So think of sunflowers. In the morning, they face the east, and as the head goes around the sun, they follow it until it sets in the west. So that would be a phototropism. Or if you have a plant that's kind of in the dark, in the shade, and it grows funny to reach the window, that's also phototropism. Gravitropism is dealing with gravity. So if a plant's pot is over and it still wants to go up towards the sun, it will grow out funny at first and then go back towards the sun. Thigmotropism, now that's kind of a weird word, but this is when a plant moves or grows in response to a touch or a contact stimuli. That's if you touch it and it has some reaction. It's pretty neat. So here are just some some ideas what's going on here. So tropism. This is phototropism. See how it's going towards the sun? Down here is thigmotropism. This is how it is by the fence. And so since it's next to something, it utilizes it to help get higher, for example. Here's one of gravitropism on a hill slope. How if you're coming straight out of the hill, you go at an angle, but the sun is above, and so you have to curve to go up. And like I talked about with the sunflowers with phototropism, here's another gravitropism. Now here's thigmotropism down here, which is really cool. I actually found a plant down in Costa Rica that does this. It's really cool. What you do is you just touch it, and then it reacts and wilts. It makes it look like there's no leaves there that the animal wants to eat. It's pretty fascinating. Let's talk now about plant defense mechanisms. Let's start with the leaves. There are thorns or hairs to discourage predators, right? How many of you actually touched a cactus or something that looked fuzzy but turned out to be something that really was painful? There's also chemical toxins. There's morphine, Taxol, caffeine. I mean, there's so many things like that. There's histamine. This disrupts animals' digestive enzymes. There's volatile molecules, and some of these will bring in animals' assistance, right? So here's this cool study I was looking at. But the primary functions of airborne VOCs, which are these volatile molecules, are to defend plants against herbivores and pathogens, to attract pollinators, seed dispersals, and other beneficial animals and microorganisms, and to serve as signals in plant-plant communication. So these plants, if one's getting attacked, it can send out this chemical, and it can warn other plants around it, and they can respond, depending on what type of plant it is, to this stimuli or this predation. So it's pretty cool how even plants can communicate in a way with each other. Plants also have hypersensitive response. They can actually have local cell deaths that seal off infected areas. So sometimes if there's a limb or something on a tree, let's say it gets infected by something, the plant will literally shut it off and kind of amputate, if you will, that limb, so that there's no nutrition that's going there, and it will die off, and hopefully taking the disease or infection with it. There are also mutualistic relationships that I don't want you to forget. We've talked about these before. The roots and fungus, that equals mycorrhizae, and the roots and bacteria, which equal root nodules. So make sure you guys know those. And then just for your review, monocots versus eudicots. Make sure you know the differences between the seed, the root, the stem, the leaf, and the flowers if they're present. Okay. I hope this was beneficial for you guys. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and good luck.